minutes?
That sounds good.
Perfect. That's what I'll aim for. Hi, everyone. So my name is Matthew. My talk today is going to focus on this book that I've been working on for the past 4 years, which came out last week. My plan is to sort of privilege breadth over depth and just give you a sense of sort of skim over a bunch of different topics, giving you a sense of the book's scope and hopefully a contribution to knowledge. So the starting point for the book is this dominant portrayal of African agriculture as one that is unproductive and stagnating. And of course, there are lots of statistics to reinforce this framing, where African agriculture is well behind what it is in other parts, other low-income countries. If you look at yields in Africa right now, they're very comparable to what they were all the way back in the 1960s. And on average, African agriculture achieves less than 2/3 of what's achieved in other parts of the developing world. The major rhetorical device for understanding the low productivity of African agriculture is what's known as the yield gap, the difference between actual and realized yields, or between what is possible and what's actually realized on farmer fields. And the yield gap in Africa is greater than anywhere else in the world. The primary explanation for this stagnating agricultural production, this extremely pronounced yield gap, has to do with the system of agricultural production that's dominant throughout the continent, right? And this is smallholder farming. So in the book, I define smallholder farming as farmers who holdings with holdings of under 3 hectares, who are have low reliance on external inputs, who are producing for their internal household consumption first, and if they have any excess, they're selling that at the local market. And so smallholders constitute about 80% of all the producers across the continent. About 70% of all the food produced in Africa is done so by smallholder farmers. Another reason why Africa's yield gap is so pronounced is because it missed out on the single most transformational event in agricultural development in the 20th century, which is the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, of course, was this huge investment in high-yielding varieties of commodity crops, especially maize, wheat, and rice. And while the impacts of the Green Revolution today are still hotly debated, what's clear is that Africa did not receive that investment that was directed primarily at parts of South Asia and Latin America. So to overcome that lack of original Green Revolution, development donors, especially the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation and the United States Agency for International Development in 2006 to create a uniquely African Green Revolution, a huge investment in new technologies and new techniques designed to help overcome this yield gap and catalyze the stagnating levels of agricultural production across the continent. Seeds and technology are at the heart of this new African Green Revolution. The first principle of AGRA, sorry I should have said that, that's the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, which was started in 2006. The first pillar of AGRA is no improved seed, no Green Revolution. So as the push for Africa's Green Revolution began to expand, so too did the enthusiasm for using new genome-based techniques to increase productivity, and especially these techniques were focused on genetic modification, which I'll introduce more in a sec. So at its core, when the book talks about Africa's gene revolution, I'm talking about this sort of complex alliance of philanthropic foundations, biotechnology companies, and bilateral development donors who have partnered together in order to mobilize genetic modification, these new genome-based breeding techniques, as tools to address this productivity gap, this yield gap in African agriculture. And at its core, Africa's gene revolution is really being driven by 2 donors, the United States Agency for International Development and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So, the book examines the potential for Africa's Green Revolution to alleviate poverty and hunger amongst smallholder farmers in Africa by focusing on the most promising of these genome-based breeding techniques, genetic modification. So the book surveys the full gamut of GM crops that have been already released alongside a whole new host of GM varieties that are currently under experimentation. And the goal is to offer a systematic assessment of GM's capacity to increase agricultural development across the continent. So this book is based on fieldwork that's been conducted over about 11 years, over 125 interviews, undertaken across 5 different African countries, and for the past 6 years I've been undertaking farm-based research, which I'll tell you more about in a sec. And the goal really is, again, to gather farmer perspectives and examine the potential for these new breeding techniques to improve agricultural development in Africa. So these are the table of contents for the book. Again, what I'm going to do is just skim over each one of these just to give you a sense of how the whole thing comes together. So I start the book with the technology. A lot of people have very strong feelings about genetic modification. Very few people understand exactly what it is. Genetic modification is just another breeding system. So for thousands of years, we've been breeding different crops to try to express favorable traits. So these could be higher yields or larger fruit or pest resistance. And of course, we've been doing that based on the phenotype, on the physical expression of that particular characteristic. And so we've used mass breeding and backcrossing to try to isolate and stabilize those beneficial traits in generations of crops. And that process is certainly effective, but it's also messy because it's very difficult to identify the specific gene that codes for that particular beneficial trait you're trying to perpetuate throughout the population. Genetic modification is a laboratory technique that allowed scientists for the first time to identify and isolate the particular gene that codes for that particular trait. And what scientists are able to do is they're able to isolate and identify that gene. They're able to remove it from the donor organism, insert it into the recipient or host organism, which is often a high-performing variety, such that the progeny, this new genetically modified version, is identical to its parent in every single way, except it now has that gene that codes for that beneficial trait of increased yield or a larger fruit or pest resistance within its DNA. So what is particularly novel about genetic modification is the fact that for the first time, scientists are able to transplant the specific particular gene that codes for that specific or particular trait, and for the first time it allowed us to cross the species barrier. So you can take a gene from a bacterium, put it into a plant, you can take a gene from a tomato, put it into maize. The uptake of genetic modification across the world, of course, is very uneven. It's a huge part of our agricultural systems here in North America, Australia, Argentina, increasing part of Chinese and Indian agricultural systems. Europe has taken the most reticent stand towards genetic modification. And Africa, up until about 15 years ago, was sort of the last frontier. It was only in 1997 that the first genetically modified crop was introduced in Africa. And Africa is sort of a microcosm for the rest of the world, and that the uptake of GM crops has been very uneven. Some crops have really embraced these technologies, especially South Africa, Burkina Faso, Sudan, and Egypt are the only 4 countries that have both the scientific and the regulatory capacity to actually grow genetically modified crops. And what I do in the book is I sort of go through sort of a typology of the different responses that African states have had towards either embracing this technology and commercializing it, or other states have taken a much more reticent and reluctant stance. So the second part of the book is focused on what I call first generation genetically modified crops. So if you look around the world, 95% of all the GM crops that are grown are one of 2 types. They're either insect resistant or they're herbicide tolerant. So these are both proprietary technologies owned by the large multinational seed corporations that we're all very familiar with. BT cotton or BT soybean or BT maize gets its name from the bacterium, which is Bacillus thuringiensis. And this bacterium is naturally resistant to the genus Leptodera, which is a genus of insect that contains the cotton bollworm and the maize stem borer, which are very pernicious insects. And so what scientists at Monsanto were able to do in the 1970s was isolate and extract the gene in the bacterium that confers resistance to those insects, transplant it into cotton and maize and canola, such that BT cotton, BT maize, BT canola are identical to its parent in every way, but now they too have this resistance to the insect. And the second major type of genetically modified first generation GMO is herbicide tolerant. So of course most of these multinational seed corporations started as chemical companies, and what they're able to do is create a whole generation of genetically modified crops that are resistant to the major herbicides. So they can spray a field, it will kill every single living thing except for, or every living plant, except for these genetically modified crops. So what I do in the book is I go through one chapter around Bt cotton, one chapter in Bt maize, evaluating the impacts of these first-generation GMOs for smallholder farmers in Africa. The first case comes from South Africa. So South Africa was the first country in Africa to legislate the commercialization of GMOs back in 1997. Monsanto entered the country in 1998 with their proprietary technology Bt cotton, and they were particularly interested. They targeted a region of the country which is just in the northwest, which is called the northeast, which is called the Makatini Flats, just that rural corner of South Africa, just below the border with Mozambique and Swaziland. Makatini Flats is a very poor part of South Africa. Employment in the formal sector is under 10%. HIV rates in the late 90s were extremely high. They've gotten a bit better now. The farmers there are primarily subsistence farmers, but the major commodity crop is cotton. So these are smallholder farmers, some of whom have one commodity crop that they're looking to earn some income, and that is cotton. Monsanto introduced their Bt cotton in 1998. 2 years later, adoption rates among these smallholder farmers had skyrocketed from initially around 7% to over 90% in 2 years. And this was a huge success story for Monsanto and for other proponents of GMOs, because it was the first example showing how genetically modified crops can offer benefits to these poor smallholder farmers. Enormous media coverage of these sky-high adoption rates, articles in Washington Post, the New York Times. The head of the Ubangwa Farmers Association, who was the biggest association, farmers association, who was part of this group of adopters, was flown to 14 different countries to give his firsthand account of how genetically modified cotton has benefited both his yields and his livelihoods. Over the long term, though, this story of success has not held out. So you can see this is data that I've collected both on production in terms of bales and the number of smallholder farmers who are growing Bt cotton in Makatini Flats. You can see a huge surge initially in 98, 99, and there have been ups and downs throughout the years. But over the past 7 or 8 years, the numbers have plummeted over the long term. And so what I did was I collaborated with a couple of colleagues who are at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and we undertook a bunch of surveys and focus group with farmers. We did some transect walks, and we tried to contextualize these claims of success. And our major findings in South Africa were that how we sort of account for this trajectory, this huge initial level of uptake of adoption followed by a precipitous decline, was that it comes down to the structural factors that were privileging adoption. So there were a number of reasons that farmers were telling us they were adopting Bt cotton early on that had little to do with the technology itself. So for example, farmers told us about access to market. There's only one cotton gin in Makatini Flats, and that cotton gin had friendly relations with Monsanto, and they were only willing to buy genetically modified cotton. If you wanted to grow non-genetically modified cotton, you had to transport your cotton to the next nearest cotton gin, which was about 70 kilometers away. And so farmers told us, well, we had to access this close market, so we chose the Bt cotton. There were other benefits or other factors that were shaping these high adoption rates. So they sold genetically modified cotton next to non-genetically modified cotton. But they only sold the non-genetically modified cotton in these huge bags of 25 kilograms, which is way too much seed and way too expensive for most farmers. Whereas the genetically modified version was sold in packages of 5 kilograms, which is a much more appropriate size. So again, farmers were telling us we just couldn't afford the non-genetically modified version. We gravitated towards this one was right size for our needs. The other big thing was around loans. So the company, which was called Vunisa, that was running the cotton gin in this operation in partnership with Monsanto, offered loans to any farmer who was willing to adopt Bt cotton. So a lot of farmers told us, of course, these smallholder farmers in Makatini have a very difficult time attaining that kind of credit, that the real carrot on the stick had to do with the accompanying loan that was granted if you adopted the technology, as opposed to the benefits of the technology itself. And finally, we just tracked these long-term patterns of debt, and of course, Bt cotton, because it's a proprietary technology, costs more than its non-genetically modified equivalent. The argument from the technology developers is that the increased yields you'll get from the genetically modified version will offset those higher costs at the beginning of the season, but the debt data that we got from farmers just suggested that actually debt levels got far worse than they did better over the course of their experience with Bt cotton. So the Makatini Flats in South Africa was the kind of showcase for how genetically modified crops could help poor African farmers. When that success story sort of fizzled away, another case emerged to sort of take its place. And this was in Burkina Faso. So Monsanto entered Burkina Faso in the early 2000s, once things started to look a little bleak in the Makatini Flats. Cotton production in Burkina Faso is very different than it is in the Makatini Flats. It's still undertaken by smallholder farmers, but Burkina Faso is a major cotton producer. It's the second largest producer of cotton in Africa. It's a very vertically oriented cotton system that is controlled by parastatals. So farmers can afford to buy improved seed or pesticides or herbicides on credit, which is granted them by these parastatal cotton companies, who then take those costs out of the cut at the end of the season. The other really important thing about Burkina Faso's cotton is that it's of extremely high quality. It's considered the second best cotton in Africa after Egyptian Pima. And so Monsanto brought their BT cotton to Burkina Faso in the mid-2000s. Because the cotton in Burkina Faso was so highly prized for its quality, the Burkina Faso government was insistent that any genetically modified version that Monsanto wanted to bring had to be transplanted into their local Burkina Faso variety. This is a process which is called introgression. And so there are two major reasons that Burkina Faso cotton is so highly prized. They're called staple length and high-ginning ratio. This leads to excellent quality and excellent price on an international market. Monsanto agreed, so they took their BT gene, introgressed it into the Burkina Faso variety. The resultant BT cotton, identical to its parent in every way, but it now had this insect-resistant trait within its genome. So the uptake of BT cotton in Burkina Faso was extremely high. By 2015, you had 300,000 smallholder farmers there who were growing BT cotton. It became the next showcase of how genetically modified crops could benefit smallholder farmers. But it wasn't long, again, before the success story started to fizzle. And the problems happened starting in the year 2015. And the issue had nothing to do with the farmers themselves. In fact, when I went to Burkina Faso, the farmers were extremely enthusiastic about BT cotton. The problem was that the process of introgressing the BT gene into the local Burkina Faso variety interfered with those key characteristics of high quality, which in turn fetches a good price. We don't know exactly why. I asked the Monsanto scientists. They say it has something to do with this interaction between genetics and the environment, so they had no idea. I talked to a number of cotton experts, agronomists from Texas, and they think that Monsanto, because they were so keen to replace Makatini as a sort of success story, that they rushed the introgression process. They only did 3 generations, where the standard is sort of between 5 to 7 generations. What happened was, starting in 2015, is that Burkina Faso was producing more cotton than ever before. They produced 500,000 million tons of cotton megatons of cotton in 2015. But they were unable to sell it on the local market because the quality had gone down. It fetched a low price, and they were stuck with this glut of cotton, whereas Mali next door had produced less cotton, but it retained its higher quality, and so they ended up doing better financially. So what the Burkina Faso government decided to do was phase out BT cotton completely. Despite objections from the farmers themselves, there was a steady decline in BT cotton because what's the point in being the top producer if you can't even sell it? And so by 2017, 2018, Burkina Faso has reverted back to exclusively non-genetically modified forms of cotton. I'll just make one final note that despite these very sort of temporary stories of success in both South Africa and Burkina Faso, there is still an enormous amount of research being done showing the potential benefits that these first-generation crops, especially BT cotton, can offer to smallholder farmers. Almost all of this research is being done using either econometric modeling or large-scale surveys in an attempt to quantify, often put a price on the benefits that will accrue to these farmers, despite the fact that the empirical track record is bleak. In fact, there's been rumblings over the past couple weeks that Kenya is the latest country that plans to introduce BT cotton in December of this year. So these optimistic portrayals of the technology's potential to alleviate poverty and hunger persist, despite the fact that the 2 major case studies that have been the prototypes for how this technology can succeed have largely disappeared over the long term. The final part of the book deals with second-generation genetically modified technologies. So what I do is I distinguish these from, of course, the first-generation technologies, insect-resistant or herbicide-tolerant. These are proprietary technologies integrated into commodity crops, and that's the vast majority of genetically modified crops that are cultivated around the world. But there is a new generation of genetically modified crops that are under experimentation in Africa, and these are quite distinct from these first-generation crops that we've just encountered. The first major distinction is that these are not commodity crops. These are orphan crops, right? Orphan crops are generally crops that have largely been ignored in terms of innovation and investment, but are enormously important in terms of their value to smallholder farmers. So in Africa, crops like cassava or millet or sorghum or cooking banana, these are crops, Monsanto's never going to make a genetically modified version of cassava because it's a crop that's eaten primarily by poor people. There's just no profit incentive there. So what development agencies did, and this is especially an initiative of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they decided to act as facilitators, and they approached the technology developers, the large multinational corporations, and also lots of smaller technology developers based in Taiwan and Singapore and Switzerland and Japan, and they asked whether these corporations would be willing to donate their genetically modified constructs license-free for use in these orphan crops to alleviate humanitarian concerns. So there's not a profit-making imperative here. The Gates Foundation established what's known as the African Agricultural Technology Foundation, who act as a broker so that these proprietary technologies could be used to help farmers who needed them most. Not only were these new genetically modified versions of staple crops designed to or focused on crops that really mattered to poor farmers, but they also zeroed in on traits that mattered to poor farmers. So there are now experimental programs that are dedicated to developing drought-tolerant varieties of maize in East and West Africa. This is the Water Efficient Maize for Africa program. There's virus-resistant cassava, so cassava mosaic disease and brown streak disease are two terrible viruses in cassava, so they're trying to genetically modify cassava to resist those diseases. Biofortification, so increasing especially vitamin A and iron to reduce under 5 mortality, and sorghum, insect-resistant cowpea. So these are all public-private partnerships in which the genetically modified construct is given license-free. The experimentation is being done by national scientists. And when these genetically modified crops are released, they will be released license-free. Farmers will not have to pay any intellectual property on them. They'll be able to replant them, recycle them, share seed as they would with any conventional variety. So I'll just tell you a bit about some of the research I've been doing recently. So one of the chapters is focused on this crop, which is Motoki banana in Uganda. So if you've ever been to Uganda, you know how important Motoki banana is. So this is not a dessert banana. It's not the Cavendish banana that we're all familiar with. Motoki banana is eaten before it's raw. So it's eaten when it's still green. It's peeled and it's boiled and it's mashed and then it's roasted over a fire wrapped in banana leaves for about 4 hours, and what results is this sort of this mashed banana, which is similar in consistency to mashed potatoes. And Motoki is by far the single most important carbohydrate staple in Uganda. It accounts for about 30% of the country's daily caloric intake. In fact, Ugandans consume on average per capita more than half a kilogram of banana per day. They are the single biggest per capita consumers of banana in the world. So an example of one of these orphan crops, right? Enormously important to food security in Uganda. It's not a crop that's eaten outside of the Great Lakes region. There's never going to be a private company who's going to genetically modify Motoki. But, of course, farmers in Uganda struggle with all sorts of abiotic and biotic constraints. The most pernicious is banana bacterial wilt, which is this terrible bacterial disease that migrated from Ethiopia about 15 years ago that has wiped out banana plantations, especially in the southwest part of the country. It's extremely difficult to control because it's spread both through the soil, through 2 different vectors, one soil-borne and one is an insect. There are insects like boll weevils, there are worms like nematodes, there are fungi, and there are viruses. And so what these development agencies have done is they've gotten these private corporations to donate genetically modified constructs to resist each one of these pests and diseases in Uganda. There's also a separate experimental program that's genetically modifying Motoki to biofortify, so to increase vitamin A, because of course banana is mostly water, it doesn't have a lot of nutrients, to help reduce maternal and under 5 mortality. The goal eventually is to combine all of these genetically modified traits into one super banana. They call it Banana 21, the banana for the 21st century. So this is just the process of genetically modifying Motoki. So it happens first in the laboratory, and then the greenhouse, and then the confined field trials. Right now, these genetically modified Motokis are at the level of multi-locational trials. So they're in farmer fields, but there isn't yet the legislative capacity to commercialize these to farmers. The technology developers are hoping that's going to happen early in the new year. So the research questions that I was asking was to the farmers themselves. You know, these discussions around the potential for genetically modified Motoki to alleviate poverty and hunger were really centered among the research scientists who were doing the work and the development donors who were providing the money. So my question was about, what do farmers think about these technologies? Are they excited about them? Will they adopt them? So I engaged in a couple of projects that used different forms of participatory ranking techniques, like side-by-side comparisons, hypothetical scenarios, different ranking exercises to communicate to farmers some of the advantages and disadvantages that these genetically modified versions of Motoki would present. And the goal of this research was really to amplify farmer perspectives on these soon-to-be-released varieties. So we went around the country. After we did the quantitative ranking exercises, we also followed up with qualitative focus groups to try to really identify why farmers felt the way they did. So we wanted to create a random representative data set from banana farmers across the country. So we started with the most recent agricultural census, and then we sampled randomly at the level of the 3 major Motoki growing regions, and then at the level of counties, and then districts, and then sub-counties, and then parishes, and then villages, and then eventually individual households. So we ended up with a sample of just under 200 farmers drawn from 7 different sub-counties from across the 3 major growing regions. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the major results of this research. I'll just tell you briefly, the first question was just about, we were interested in what variables were going to shape farmer perspectives on these bananas. Were male farmers going to be more enthusiastic than female farmers? Were larger farmers more enthusiastic than smaller scale farmers? And so we were able to identify 5 variables that that influence positive attitudes and intentions to adopt. I won't go through these in detail. All I'll say is that all of these variables are related to affluence and influence. And so certainly the conclusion from the first research question was just that farmers who are in a more advantageous position seemed more enthusiastic and seemed like they would be the early adopters. And so the question was just how much reach these genetically modified varieties were going to be among more disenfranchised groups. We also asked questions about whether the priorities that had been determined by the donors and the scientists matched up with the realities that farmers encountered on the ground. So we asked farmers, if you could genetically modify a Motoki, what trait would you want to prioritize? And farmers were quite unanimous that they wanted a larger bunch, which of course gives more food, or if you sell to the market, gives more money. And the next major traits that were prioritized by farmers were disease resistance, especially to that banana bacterial wilt, which has done so much damage, and drought tolerance. But the first genetically modified banana that's going to be released, probably sometime next year, is that biofortified variety that I mentioned, the one that has the increased vitamin A and iron. And the reason, of course, is because that's where the money is. This was funded through the Bill and Melinda Gates, their Grand Challenges in Global Health. And so when we talked about biofortification, of the 14 different traits, biofortification was ranked 3rd to the bottom. So the concern here is just about the disconnect between the priorities that are being expressed within the experimental agenda and whether those match up with the priorities of the farmers themselves. And just some other questions or concerns that I have about these soon-to-be-released experimental varieties. First is about high cost. Now again, farmers are not going to pay for the genetic modification. There's no IP with these new genetically modified banana when they're going to be released. But the genetically modified banana is going to be released via tissue culture, which is another biotechnological technique which effectively just amounts to micropropagation. Tissue culture are much more expensive than just a conventional sucker. They cost about 2.5 or 3 times more. And so one of the things that really came up in our discussions with farmers is that this could be a major barrier to entry. The increased costs associated with these genetically modified varieties, which has nothing to do with the genetically modified construct, but rather has to do with the vessel into which it is inserted. The final point is also around the transplantation of the genetically modified construct into the host variety. There are 200 different kinds of Motoki banana. Whether they're in finger form or food form, they look and taste all the same to me, but of course Ugandans can distinguish those varieties that are particularly tasty and have a really rich color and retain moisture well. There are certain traditional varieties that are highly coveted and fetch a higher price at the market. The national scientists who are in charge of these experiments know exactly which those varieties are, and they tried to genetically modify those preferred varieties. But the science didn't work, especially this process of embryogenic cell development. So instead they had to settle on this kind of middle-of-the-road variety, which is called Nachanyika, which is weak to wind and produces a kind of a mealy white color. And so the first genetically modified bananas that are going to be released are going to be genetically modified versions of Nachanyika. And the concern is that a lot of farmers don't like Nachanyika. They don't want to grow Nachanyika. And so even if there is this advantageous trait, farmers might be reluctant to adopt because the variety into which it was inserted doesn't match up with their value-based preferences. Okay. So, I promised an assessment of the potential for genetically modified crops to alleviate poverty and hunger in Africa. So I got about 8 minutes left, and that is where I will end. In the conclusion of the book, I'm pretty unequivocal about the potential for these first-generation crops to help agricultural development in Africa. I just don't think it's going to happen. First-generation genetically modified crops, BT cotton, BT maize, were designed to succeed in a particular agricultural system, that of industrial agriculture, one that is large-scale and monocropped and center-pivot irrigation and heavily capitalized and heavily mechanized. Transplanting these technologies into rural Africa, which has totally different agricultural production systems, and expecting that they're going to succeed in a similar fashion is just ridiculous. And the empirical record backs that up. As I showed with those cases of both the Makatini Flats in South Africa and Burkina Faso, when you have an enabling environment, when you have institutional factors that are privileging the adoption of the genetically modified version over the non-genetically modified version, you can succeed in the short term. But once those enabling factors disappear, so too does the farmer appetite for these technologies. I'm more bullish on the potential for second-generation technologies to help African farmers. I think they offer a compelling redress to many of these shortcomings. They focus on crops and traits that matter to smallholder farmers. They're not bogged down by the same cumbersome intellectual property agreements that restrict first-generation GMOs. But many of the second-generation technologies that I cover in the book, including insect-resistant maize and virus-resistant sweet potato and water-efficient maize for Africa, remain mired in some of these ruinous patterns that have undermined previous agricultural development programs. Of all the second-generation genetically modified crops that are under experimentation, the one that I'm the most bullish on is that genetically modified Motoki banana that's resistant to BBW. And that's a really tricky one because banana is a really difficult crop to improve via conventional means. Banana reproduces clonally. It's effectively sterile. So breeders have been trying to generate an improved variety of Motoki that's resistant to BBW via conventional means. They've had zero luck. So in that case, when you're focused on a crop that's really difficult to improve via other mechanisms, a trait that is devastating the countryside and really matters to poor farmers, I think that's a technology that deserves a chance. But what I do in the conclusion is sort of underscore the limitations of this rhetorical device of the yield gap, which is really, again, that fulcrum for Africa's gene revolution. And what I do is I challenge this kind of very narrow framing of the yield gap and argue that it ignores these 3 other dimensions that we really need to take into account if we're going to understand how and whether new technologies can contribute to agricultural development. So while I recognize that the notion of a context, methods, scale gap is neither as pithy nor as catchy as that of a yield gap, these are the 3 issues that I think we really need to pay attention to and engage with if we're going to understand whether and how new agricultural technologies can make a difference in the lives of smallholder farmers. So I make the point in the book that it's impossible to separate out the technology from its context. And a lot of proponents of genetically modified technology argue that these are silver bullet technologies that can succeed anywhere. And again, the empirical record, especially in the Makatini Flats and in Burkina Faso, show that if accompanied by an enabling context, these technologies can buoy adoption rates for a certain period. But without that concomitant investment in access to markets and credit and extension and irrigation, these technologies just have no chance of success. The second point is about methods. The science of GM is moving way faster than the social scientific evaluation of its potential to make a difference on the ground. And so the vast majority of the studies that have estimated the potential for these new technologies to make a difference have relied on these two methods of econometric modeling and large-scale surveys. And there's a dearth of farm-based studies that evaluate the fit between this new technology and the farming system into which it is designed to ameliorate. And there's a whole just lot of bad research out there. Some of it, of course, is just funded by the technology developers, and some of these biases and assumptions are much more subtle. And so if you've read the work of anthropologist Glenn Stone, he talks about all these different biases, cultivation bias and selection bias, that leads to this sort of sense that there's a consensus within the literature that these technologies can really make an overwhelming positive contribution. And so I'm advocating for longer-term studies because we've seen in the short term that there can be a quick uptake, but that those successes aren't sustained in the long term. A focus on how these new genetically modified varieties impact categories of power, and especially the area of gender. We know that new agricultural technologies are going to shape gender-based dynamics in important ways, but there is no research that examines how these new genetically modified varieties, the impacts of these new genetically modified varieties on intra-household dynamics. And also a better understanding of farmer decision-making, especially as it relates, much of the research on genetically modified crops assumes that farmers are rational actors who are going to choose a higher yield over all other factors. But of course, we know that farmers make all sorts of decisions, some of which are rational, some of which are not, based on lots of characteristics of crops that they grow, including things like storability and poundability and taste and color and texture and all those types of things. The final point is just about scale. There is a huge enthusiasm for upscaling genetically modified technology within this push towards Africa's gene revolution. And I argue that the major blind spot within the gene revolution is the ability to downscale, to adapt these local biotechnologies to suit local practice. And so I sort of shine a light on what I think is one of the major problems here, which is this very linear technology pipeline, a mode of addressing urgent development needs like poverty and hunger in Africa by creating new products that meets demand that is presumed rather than confirmed. So again, remember that case of the genetically modified Motoki, when farmers are asking for genetically modified Motoki that has larger bunches and resistant to disease and drought, but the development donors have invested in one that is going to be biofortified. So the characteristics of the gene revolution's experimental regime, it's one that's top-down, it's trial-driven, it's beholden to a results-based framework, rigid delivery schedules, short-term targets, onerous requirements for transparency and accountability. And I argue that we just need a total overhaul of how farmer-based input is incorporated within this technology pipeline. And so I make some recommendations, and I'm not going to have a chance to talk about these in any detail, but questions that we can ask, and certainly variables that need to be taken into consideration within these three realms of context, methods, and scale. I talk about the shift from technology transfer to technology co-development. So again, with this argument that the gene revolution technology pipeline is broken, trying to figure out an approach that is less ambitious, that's underpinned by longer-term grants, committed to rigorous social science, and then just exploring other ways that this kind of technology co-development has been achieved across Africa. Using an agroecological approach, which I know among folks in this room there are lots of folks in this room who know more about the value and the potential for agroecology than I do. So my final thoughts in the book are just about looking back in order to move forward. As I was writing the conclusion, I kept coming back to two books that I had read when I was a graduate student here at UBC, both Timothy Mitchell's Rule of Experts and Joseph Hodge's Triumph of the Experts, and just focusing on how the history of agricultural development in Africa offers these precedents of what does not work. We can look back over 2 centuries of colonial and state-led agricultural development efforts, all of which started with the premise that African farming systems are backwards, are unproductive, in urgent need of transformation. And, some of the most notorious, including the Gazira scheme in Sudan, the East Africa Groundnut scheme, the Office du Niger in Mali. And Joseph Hodge in his books talks about how the colonial agricultural period was the first green revolution, the first agricultural revolution in Africa, fueled by expert knowledge, imbued with this unbridled faith in science and technology. And I argue that these same tropes keep repeating themselves with Africa's gene revolution. Both the framing of the problem and the solution echo these centuries of top-down, technocratic development planning. And these continuities are especially pronounced within the attitudes of the experts themselves, both the donors who are committed to exploring cutting-edge, groundbreaking technologies as the solution to these persistent problems, and the breeders who are focused on getting the science right but not paying enough attention to how politics and power are going to shape outcomes at the farm level. So I end the book just by concluding that Africa's gene revolution epitomizes this modernist approach to agricultural development. And if Africa's gene revolution is unable to break free from these harmful legacies, then it seems destined to repeat the mistakes of the past. So I'll just end by introducing you to the people who have made this research possible. So this is Sarah Mujabi Mujuzi, who works for UNDP and who's been my collaborator in Uganda for the past 11 years. This is Hamadou Diouf, who helped with the research in Burkina Faso, and Adwoki Rogers, who's the logistics coordinator in Uganda. That's my research coordinator, and Lana Taylor. And just to pitch, if you're interested in learning more about the social opposition to these genetically modified crops, I'll be talking more about those in a couple hours. Thanks a lot for your time. I look forward to questions.
I was wondering who owns the IP in that case of the kind of case-led technological development. And I just wanted to know, because a lot of the critique, at least a farmer-centered critique of GMOs has been around the control over seeds. So I was just wanting to hear your thoughts on if that looks any different in that kind of form of technological development, or if the kind of control over the IP and the
Yeah, it looks very different. So, I mean, these are genetic constructs that are owned by companies, and the Gates Foundation has convinced these companies to waive the IP in these particular experimental programs that are being devoted or dedicated to humanitarian purposes. So what that means is that when these are commercialized, farmers are not going to have restrictions around replanting, recycling, and sharing seed, which they do have with first-generation GMOs, right? So BT maize, which is grown in South Africa, when you grow BT maize, you have to sign a contract, a stewardship agreement, saying that you're not going to replant those seed the next year. You can't sell it to your neighbor or share with your friend, right? Those kinds of restrictive buying arrangements are not going to be at play within these second-generation GMOs. Some of these experimental programs have certain restrictions, so especially in maize, which is a tougher one, right? Because it's a crop that accounts for a huge amount of carbohydrate. It's a huge carbohydrate staple in Africa, but it's also a moneymaker. So with a lot of the genetic constructs that have been devoted with maize, the companies have asked for some kind of threshold. Like, we'll give it for free to farmers who are growing less than 10 hectares or 100 hectares of maize. But if it's a larger scale producer, at that point, we want them to pay for it, and we want those stewardship arrangements to be mandated and enforced.
I guess just a clarification. I was confused about with the banana, the distribution of this banana. You were saying that the trees are more expensive because they're produced in tissue culture. So once the growers have the trees from tissue culture, can they then produce suckers?
Yes, so that's a great, yeah, so the barrier to entry is only an initial one. So because banana is grown clonally, right? So you grow a banana plant, it takes about 9 months to grow from. It starts off with what's called a sucker, which is banana seed, and it goes 9 months to kind of fruit, and then it usually takes 15 months to fruit, but 9 months for it to grow a daughter, which is genetically identical, right, in the same stool, and then 9 months after that, there'll be another one. So if I'm growing genetically modified Motoki, right, I buy it for 2.5 or 3 times what it would cost a normal sucker, and this genetically modified Motoki is resistant to BBW, or it's biofortified, or maybe it's both. I grow it in my garden, I wait 9 months, that daughter, which has the same genetically modified properties, I'm able to dig that up, give it to you, and you can grow it on your plantation. So that initial barrier to entry around cost is only at that first level of dissemination. Afterwards, over time, the idea is that these networks of farmers will be able to share and recycle and spread that technology in a horizontal fashion.
I found the two Africa cases for BD cotton quite interesting because it's a little different in the case that I'm most familiar with, which is India. There is no non-BD cotton grown, right? It's just like 100% of cotton grown in India is BD, and it's to call it BD, there are literally hundreds of hybrids, maybe thousands, right? Which all have the BD gene inserted in them through a host of local companies. All these little farms that then do, and so a little bit of controversy just given the nature of this particular seed, but you know, the best analysis that I see suggests there's been a doubling of yields, tripling in certain places, largely related to the idea of a reduced herbicide, right? Because the bollworm was such a debilitating insect for cotton crops in South Asia that in fact yields in South Asia were half to a third in other parts of the world. This technology comes along, there's a trend break, boom, yields are doubled, and now you have this whole ecosystem of firms that are producing these seeds. Meanwhile, there are rogue companies, small farmer-led companies that are growing, that are creating their own seed with sort of stealing technology and basically not adhering to all the IP laws. In the Indian context, the IP laws don't apply anyway. It's a slightly different thing. So I'm trying to then think about that case, which personally I think is an unqualified success, even though the literature might say a lot of different things about it. How does that relate to what you see in Burkina Faso and South Africa, right? Because I can see many different differences between these two cases. For instance, the absence of local seed companies. So I imagine that in a case like Burkina Faso, if there was this sort of, I don't quite know what the ecosystem of seed farms looks like, but if there was a bunch of seed companies that are taking local hybrids, right, and in contract with Monsanto inserting the BT gene, you may not have run into that problem of the small states, right? So I don't quite know, so it'd be nice to know what the nature of seed production in Burkina Faso is. And in the South Africa case, it would be nice to know the extent to which herbivory or bollworms actually reduced yields. Right? So because if the impact was not great, then you would expect that the yield increases wouldn't actually make up for whatever changes that were needed to the way you produce things.
Yeah.
So 2 questions.
Great. I just remembered I'm supposed to repeat the question for the microphone. So the question was about the sort of the comparability of the sort of short-term successes but long-term failures in Makatini Flats in South Africa and Burkina Faso to, you're right, what has been sort of largely portrayed as a long-term success of BT cotton in India and elsewhere, right? We see that with genetically modified soy in parts of Brazil and BT cotton in China as well.
Just think about poor farmers as the category, right?
Right.
So to the extent that you can make that product out in India.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right in identifying 2 crucial differences. I mean, I think that the general consensus within the scientific literature is that BT cotton can be more remunerative for both smallholder and largeholder farmers because it reduces those costs around pesticide use, and there are corollary health benefits to that as well. Generally, there's more disputing whether the yield benefits are better than a sort of, a high-yielding conventional variety. But you're right, in the right system, I think BT cotton could work, and certainly the Indian case study suggests that. I think you're right about two of the crucial differences in the cases in Africa that are going to be very difficult to overcome. First is, how significant is bollworm as an impediment to production? And your question is, how significant was it in South Africa? Not very. The major impediment to cotton production in South Africa is cloud cover and just not enough heat for cotton to fully thrive. So in that case, you've got a sort of the solution coming before the problem, right? And BT cotton is introduced. This can help smallholder farmers, but unless it meaningfully addresses an ecological constraint to production, it's not going to have a significant impact. And the second point, you're absolutely right. In both South Africa and Burkina Faso, and in many countries in Africa, you don't have a very well-developed private seed sector. And it's difficult to imagine first-generation genetically modified crops really enjoying success without that being there. Having said that, I mean, the case of BT cotton in India is still contested, right? And I think that one of the, for my money, I mean, the most valuable contributions there have come from Glenn Stone, who's done a longitudinal study in a couple sites over the part of now 20 to 25 years, showing that yes, there have been some benefits that the technology has offered, but also showing that there have been major methodological weaknesses that have overestimated some of those benefits. And he's, I think, made an important contribution sort of qualifying where the technology has both advantages but also limitations.
Yeah, no, I mean, the way I see the India case is even if some of the doubling of yields is kind of overestimated in some places, the sheer magnitude of the impact is unprecedented. Nothing but the Green Revolution has had that kind of an impact at that scale on the incomes of that many people. So anyway, that's so it's kind of interesting that the African case doesn't, and it tells us a lot about what the idea of development is, because it doesn't, every place is its own thing, right? So just because it's successful in India with the sort of scientific infrastructure that it has and the entrepreneurship in the seed companies, particularly in Gujarat, which is one province, that doesn't necessarily mean that's replicable in other parts of the world.
I think you're absolutely right. That's the danger, right? It's that sort of cookie cutter formula that if it worked there, well, why don't we just try it in this other place? But without a foundational understanding of how farming systems work in that place, it's unlikely you're going to have a great fit between the technology and the context.
Thank you for a great talk. I have one long, one short question. So the shorter question is, like you mentioned in the Burkina Faso case, with regards to like the introgression of BT genes that cause declines in desirable traits, and you mentioned that it's the farmers who were still excited about the technology, and I wasn't clear why. And then the other question is, I'm curious with regards to the second generation GM. I'm curious what's the real incentives. I mean, they've claimed for humanitarian reasons, but we all know, like that's not the only thing they care about. So I'm just curious what your take on that is.
Yeah. Okay, so the first question is about Burkina Faso and this question of introgression. If it did interfere with that crucial issue of quality and price, then why were farmers so enthusiastic? Again, it has to do with the sort of the farming system that pervades there, right? Farmers have a guaranteed price that is set by these parastatal cotton companies. And their yields went up. They used less pesticides because of the BT cotton. They were getting the same price. So from their end, everything was working as it should. The low price didn't impact what trickled down to the farmers. The low price was felt by those parastatal cotton companies who were accumulating all of this cotton and then selling it on the global market. And when they saw BT Cotton as a profit-making enterprise, they didn't really care if the farmers were still enthusiastic about it. They saw it as a profit-losing enterprise, and they're the ones who made the decision to phase it out. So there was a disconnect there between the interests of the farmers and the interests of those cotton companies who really had an enormous amount of control over the commodity chain. And then your second question was about incentives for the second generation, these genetically modified versions of orphan crops. So, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about that. You know, more critical takes on Africa's gene revolution suggest that this is a bit of a Trojan horse, so that this is an opportunity for these private multinational seed companies to gain a foothold in Africa through these not-for-profit humanitarian ventures, and that will facilitate a longer-term expansion of their commercial interests. Other people, of course, point to the public relations element, and that has been the major pitch from the Gates Foundation. Look, you're not going to make money off this, but you know, this allows you to portray yourself as a company that's committed not just to higher profits, but also to alleviating poverty and hunger in some of, you know, for some of the world's most struggling farmers. The really interesting work there has been about the cross-pollination between some of these multinational corporations and the Gates Foundation itself. So Rachel Sherman, who's a sociologist at the University of Minnesota, has a great piece in the Journal of Agrarian Change where she talks about, she does an ethnography of this African Agricultural Technology Foundation and shows how much of the Gates Foundation, who are, again, are the key facilitators and brokers for these public-private partnerships, come from these same companies, are able to build upon those networks. And so she argues there's a real confluence of interests between the philanthropic capital that is driving this major investment on the part of the Gates Foundation in agricultural development and the interests of the private companies themselves who are donating this technology for humanitarian purposes.
So this isn't quite my field, but I'm curious, a two-part question. One, I'm curious, have you seen like similar pushbacks to GMOs in Africa and other places where it's seen as like unnatural or like just like pushback from the religious standpoint or whatever standpoint like that, specifically in regards to like the host species being far away from the donor species? And is there any like movement within geneticists to try to take the genes from more closely related plants or species to try to minimize that gap?
Yeah.
Or whether or not that gap is actually a thing in the real world, or maybe it's more in the media.
Yeah. So in the talk tonight, I'm going to talk a lot about what that resistance looked like and in what ways the resistance to GMOs has kind of been echoing some of those global tropes around both health concerns, ethical issues. The two that, and certainly there is a lot of that happening across the continent, but also it manifests itself in really different ways. So the one question I get a lot in Africa is it possible to take a gene from a pig and put it into a plant? Which for Muslims is just the idea that it could be sort of, you know, hidden ways of getting around traditional restrictive eating patterns. The other one that I hear a lot in sub-Saharan Africa is around sterility. So there's all sorts of debates around, you know, carcinogenic qualities of GMOs and allergies, and most of that has been established and disproven. I mean, all of us in this room, if you've been living in Canada over the past 20 years, you've been consuming genetically modified crops for that period. But the question of sterility is often really pronounced because it's so important in so many African cultures. Is your second question just about whether it's, you know, whether the science is moving to get beyond the gap between the donor and the recipient organism? The answer is absolutely. So this kind of genetic modification is called transgenesis because it takes a gene from one organism and inserts it into another. The next generation of genetically modified crops is going to be cisgenesis. So some of you will have heard of gene editing and this new technology called CRISPR, which basically amounts to molecular scissors that will allow scientists to sort of go into an organism's genome and edit or alter or remove or turn on or turn off genes that code for beneficial traits in the same ways you can with GM, but they are doing that within the plant's genome without taking foreign genetic material and inserting it. And so the major debate going on right now within both ethical and regulatory circles is, does that still constitute genetic modification? Or if you've got an organism whose DNA has been altered in the laboratory, but there's no record of that alteration taking place, isn't that just equivalent to a conventional crop? And so both Canada and the US have said, yes, it is equivalent, and they aren't going to regulate those new technologies, which are definitely coming in the next couple of years, where Europe has taken a more reticent stance. So yes, the technology has moved to overcome some of the more ethical and public relations type hurdles that have stymied some of the earlier generations.
We have time for one more question.
I just wanted to ask about cotton in Sudan. You mentioned that's recently been adopted. How is that going?
It's going really well in Sudan. So it comes back to the question about, oh, sorry. So the question is BT cotton in Sudan. And so Sudan is just a wild card in this regard. You know, most countries have to pass, in order to conform with the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety and the Convention on Biological Diversity, you have to have a legislative framework that says we as a country are going to commercialize genetically modified crops. Well, Sudan didn't do that. This was when Bashir was in power. They decided en masse to approach the Chinese, and they started growing BT cotton on tens of thousands of hectares. And while there haven't been reports in the past year, previous to that, the reports suggest that they were doing quite well in the sense that they were able to recreate the sort of patterns of production that you were describing in India, right? So this was monoculture production, you know, heavily scaled, high input, heavily capitalized. There were concerns about secondary pests, especially whitefly, which is a major issue in Sudan. There have been some reports that maybe the damage from the secondary pests has increased, while the damage from the primary pest, bollworm, has decreased. The other issue about Sudan is bollworm is a major problem there, further north, that it isn't the same kind of problem in Burkina Faso and South Africa. But since the political tumult of the last year, there haven't been any recent reports that I've seen for how it's been doing lately.
Thank you. Thank you very much.